Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak. When a loved one is nearing the end of their life, whether due to old age, illness, or something else entirely, the moments they have left are precious and important to them. They may give away items or keepsakes that they value for one reason or another, or they may just want to spend more time with those they love and care about. Another thing that may happen is they may feel the need to share information or parts of themselves that they hadn't revealed previously. It happened to me with my mother and my grandmother. Sometimes people want to get something off of their chest, or it may be something you need to hear.
And that's also what happened to Ashley Randele. Thomas Randele, known to his family and friends as a loving father and devoted husband, led a seemingly ordinary life. However, his past held a secret that would only come to light just before his passing. We sat down with Ashley to uncover her father's hidden history, the revelations that followed, and how it's shaped her understanding of identity and family legacy.
Today we're joined by Ashley Randele. Hey Ashley, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Ashley, thanks so much for being on the show.
How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. Ashley, could you just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about you.
I am Ashley Randele. A little bit about me. I am a huge theater nerd. I love Christmas and Hallmark movies. I live in New England, just about 10 minutes north of Boston. And 3 years ago, I found out that my dad was actually a wanted fugitive.
Okay.
That's an eclectic about me.
You kind of give us a little tidbit about your family secret there. But, a lot of times when a family member is kind of at the end of their life, sometimes they like to, reveal certain things or kind of give us more information about themselves that they never had revealed before, which is something that, I can identify with that. And I'm sure a lot of other people can. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that's like and why your father revealed that information?
In spring of 2021, my dad was diagnosed with a really aggressive form of lung cancer. He had had his first round of chemo, and the chemo wasn't working. It was actually making him really, really sick. A guy who I think I'd seen have 2 colds in my whole life, to see him really weak and getting frail was very jarring. I think it was also very jarring for him. He and I both have very let's be positive about the situation outlooks and always, hope for the best. And I think that it just hit him that the hope that treatment would get him a few years was probably not what was actually happening. It was just a regular afternoon. Mom, Dad, and I were in the living room hanging out, watching NCIS, which was Dad's favorite show. And it was a commercial break, I believe. And he very nonchalantly just said, "Ladies, just in case it comes up, when I moved here, I had to change my name. The authorities are probably still looking for me. And I just wanted you to know in case something comes up." And then just went right back to the television show. And for maybe 5 seconds, I thought, this is the weirdest dad joke ever. I get you want to lighten the mood of this very dark time, but what a weird choice, Dad. Okay. And then maybe about 10 seconds after that, I realized, oh, he was being serious. This is crazy. What do you do with that?
What did you say?
That afternoon, nothing. We all just continued watching NCIS. Dinner, normal day. And then because of the person I am, I'm just very curious. And I thought, if this is true, then, Dad and I have to talk about this. And so the next day, alone, I went to him. I don't know. I think Mom might have been out running errands. And I sat with him in the living room and I said, I get that maybe this is something that's difficult to talk about, but if you really did change your name is not Tom Randele, then who's Ashley Randele? You're my father, and I deserve to know my dad's name. I deserve to know my name. And that's when he told me his name was Ted Conrad. And at the time I said, okay, thank you. That's all I needed to know. And I really did think that I could just leave it at that. There's other things going on in life. Yes, this big secret was dropped on us that he had changed his name and the authorities might still be looking for him. But at the same time, my dad's in treatment for super aggressive cancer, and that's sort of taking up most of the mental bandwidth at the time. But then that night, I could not sleep. I think it was 2:30 in the morning. And I finally just pulled out my iPad and I Googled Ted Conrad. And there was a Google results page, but it was just sort of mixed. I guess that's a fairly common name. Like it's not super unique. And so then I looked up Ted Conrad missing and was just flooded with things about a bank teller who had stolen money from the vault where he worked 50 years ago. And there were articles every decade about how authorities were still looking for him, that I think the FBI went to one of the high school reunions within the past decade, thinking maybe he'd show up. And I nearly fell off the bed and thought, oh my God, my life is a Lifetime movie. That's how I found out on my own in my bedroom at 2:30 in the morning.
So at first you weren't sure what he was saying was true, and then you kind of just did your own research, and then you realized, oh my God, my dad is famous.
And not for something super fun. The fact that they were still looking for him. The original U.S. Marshal, John Elliott, was the first person on the case back in 1969 going into 1970. But then his son, Pete Elliott, became a U.S. Marshal. And he's actually the U.S. Marshal for Northern Ohio. And he took up his dad's mantle. So he and his dad had been looking for my dad their whole careers, which was very heavy to find out. And I did feel a little guilty that people were spending so much time looking for him. And this whole time, he'd just been living a quiet life in the suburbs.
Yeah, that's really interesting that the Marshal's son continued his legacy of trying to find your dad. I think that's kind of unique and surprising.
It's super fascinating. You know, the podcast that I made is really two parts. It's a caper following John and Pete Elliott as they hunt for Ted Conrad. And then the other prong is me doing a personal investigation on my dad and his life. But learning about John and Pete Elliott, incredibly fascinating and incredibly interesting.
Yeah, it seems like it's the tale of, okay, my father was unable to find this guy. I'm just going to keep going. It's like he must be found, right? It's just like to continue his father's legacy and searching for your father. That truly is fascinating. How did your mother react to all of this?
So I found out in the evening at 2:30 in the morning. That next day, I went to my dad and said, I looked you up and I now know what you did, and it does not change how I feel about you. You're my dad. I love you. This doesn't change that. And I can remember in that moment, his whole body just relaxing. I'm sure it was scary for him to share that and for me to know that he had committed this crime, but it really did not change how I felt about him. He's still my dad. I love him. And he really did look like a weight had been lifted off him. Of course, the next thing I said is, you have to tell Mom. We don't get to know this and she doesn't. And I remember him looking just so sad and saying, I can't bring myself to tell her because it's such a shocking secret. And he just didn't want to do that to her. And so I did tell him that if he couldn't, then I would, which is what ended up happening. But I still couldn't really tell her. We went in their room and it was just Mom and me. And I said, okay, so take out your computer. It was a computer or her iPad. And I said, just type in Ted Conrad. And I think at that point I was like, put in Ted Conrad, Cleveland. Like I knew what to put in. And that same Google results page came up. And we could have been sitting there for 15 minutes. It could have been an hour and a half, but it was just a whole lot of moms scrolling with giant eyes saying, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. I remember sitting there going, yep. I couldn't even say it. I didn't know how to say, hey, Mom, Dad told me his real name. I looked him up and he's actually a wanted fugitive. I couldn't even say that. I just let her read it the way that I found out. But I was with her, so it was better.
Why do you think your dad told you?
I think for many people, when they know that their time is short, there are things that they want to get off their chest so that they can rest easier. But I think that with my dad, he did not tell us for himself. Because originally he didn't tell us his name. Like, he really didn't let the secret off his chest. But he was very worried that there would be a knock at the door one day, and that Mom and I would be blindsided, and it would be really traumatic to find out that for my mom, your husband, that's not his name. And for me, your dad, that's not who you thought he was. So I think that originally he gave us just enough information so that if there ever was a knock on the door, Mom and I would say like, oh, I guess he did mention that the authorities might show up one day. And we did know he changed his name, so that he was trying to protect us as much as he could without maybe putting a burden on us. Because I can't imagine carrying that secret for 50 years. And that was one of the things that he said, was that there really was never a time to tell Mom. You're dating somebody. You're not saying, hey, by the way, I committed a crime 10 years ago and, they're still looking for me. And then you get married. And then how do you tell your wife that? And then you have kids and you build this life. And he had told me that he just didn't want to burden us and didn't want us to have to carry his secret, because that wasn't fair to us.
It's interesting. I can understand that. Like you said, there really isn't a good time to disclose that. And then as time goes on, it just kind of makes your family worry. And obviously that's what he wanted to avoid. After he told you, what is the timeline in terms of the end of his life, and what did you and your mother decide to do in terms of letting authorities know, or did you keep it to yourself? What happened?
From the time my dad was diagnosed to his death was less than 2 months. And he told us, I believe, just after his first chemo. So we had about 4 to 6 weeks, but it was about a month, maybe a little more than a month.
Yeah, that's really not long at all.
I mean, I think when you hear deathbed confession, you imagine it's like the last words out of their mouth. But for us, it was him realizing that time was just short. And we did discuss, with him, what would Mom and I do? We let him know that we would take care of it, that we would be fine. He didn't need to worry about us, and that we would handle it. We would be okay. He doesn't need to worry about that. Like, he doesn't need to worry about us knowing this and, what would happen to us. Mom and I had discussed, and we knew that we were going to tell the authorities. I mean, we knew who to call. You call Pete Elliott. His name is all over all these articles. How hard would it be to find a number to his office? But we agreed that we would wait a year. Really just because I think anybody who loses somebody that they're very close to, that first year is the hardest because it's all the firsts. It's the first birthday. So we figured, let's get through that first year, and then we will probably be in a better place to handle whatever comes from telling the authorities. But we knew it was important to tell them because they're spending time and resources still looking for him. And that was the right thing to do. That's not what happened, but that was the plan.
What happened?
Dad passed away in May of 21, and then in November of 21, just shy of 6 months after his death. I was upstairs in my bedroom, and my mom came in, and she shook me. And she said, "It's happened." And my first thought, when you have a very large family, is, oh my God, who died? Like, what happened now? And she said, no, the U.S. Marshals are here. And I said, what? Where? And she said, in the living room. And I thought, oh my good Lord. Okay. So Pete Elliott had just knocked on the door on a random, it was a Tuesday in November. And it was him and one of his deputy marshals. And we just sat in the living room, the four of us. And I think for maybe a few minutes, my mom and I tried to act like, why on earth would you be here? We have no idea. But Mom and I are apparently both terrible at fibbing. And I think they could tell from the look on our faces that we looked a little terrified that they were there, that the marshals must have said to themselves, okay, they know why we're here. A person who didn't know something would just be more confused why U.S. Marshals from Ohio were knocking on your door.
I don't even know if I would have let them in. I would have been like, well, wait, what's going on here?
Well, I think I said to Mom, you left them in the house and you left them alone? And she said, we're so far past that now. And I was like, okay.
Yeah, knowing that they're already in the house, I don't even know. I guess, yeah, you just walk downstairs and you're like, well, hey, I guess this is what it is.
Like, this is life now, apparently. Okay. And thank goodness they were just incredibly kind. Pete really is what you want all law enforcement to be. He is kind and empathetic. He has a job to do, but he's just a very thoughtful person with a lot of integrity. And one of the first things he said, or one of the first things I remember him saying, because that day is a little bit of a blur, was, "You two are not in trouble. I'm not here to get you two in trouble, but there are things that we need to talk about." And we said, okay.
It seems like he was kind of straightforward. You discovered this thing about your dad, about his identity. So how did that impact your personal sense of your identity? You know, who is Ashley Randele, and maybe your family history in general?
It was definitely very difficult at first because family is so important. I mean, my mom's family is huge. My grandmother was one of 7. So growing up, I was very lucky. I had a huge extended family, but family traditions and family history's always been something that's talked about and sort of ingrained in you. And what I knew about my dad's family was that he was an only child and his parents had passed away in a car crash when he was 18. And so I really didn't know anything about his family, but that was my dad's family history. I'm an only child who didn't have any extended family, and then moved to Boston, met my mom, and then kind of got this big family. And weirder than finding out that my dad wasn't Tom Randele, that he was Ted Conrad before he'd moved here. What was weirder was finding out that he had siblings and that my dad wasn't an only child and that there was family out there. That was very jarring. And thankfully, the Conrad siblings are super kind, been nothing but welcoming, understandably incredibly private, and really, want nothing to do with any of the talk around their brother, but super supportive of everything I've been doing and just really welcoming to both my mom and me. You do kind of take a pause and think, who am I? And I definitely struggled with that of, is my last name really Randele? I mean, it is legally. I mean, that's my birth certificate. That's my name. And I can remember when I was a kid telling my dad, because I was an only child and the last of the Randeles, if I ever got married, I would keep my name. And that if I ever had kids, I would, at bare minimum, they'd be hyphenated. The Randele name wouldn't end with me. And it's crazy to think about that the name really started with us. But the name has always been super important to me. And then, after a lot of not even soul searching, but really going through this process of learning about who my dad was before he was Tom Randele, thinking about how many sacrifices he made to be Tom Randele, to be this great husband and father, and the choices that he made to build this life, I now, for different reasons, would always keep my name Randele because I'm, really appreciative of everything he did to give me this great life.
You're a proud Randele.
I'm a very proud Randele. I have monogrammed, forever, I have enamel boxes that has your initial, the monogram on the front, and that's out in my living room with a big R.
Do you have any idea how the U.S. Marshals found your father?
My understanding, and this genuinely is from reading articles that came out after, the U.S. Marshals had that press conference in November of 21. And then there were a ton of articles that came out, and I read all of them. And so my understanding is that somebody, I do not know who, sent my dad's obituary to a crime writer in Cleveland who had written about Ted Conrad over the years. So somebody emailed her saying, hey, if you're still interested in the Ted Conrad case, pretty sure this is the guy. And then this crime writer sent that tip to the U.S. Marshals, who then did a whole investigation and were matching up signatures. And they did whatever they do for a few months. And then they essentially confirmed it. And then coming to us was sort of that final dotting the I's, crossing the T's. So I still have no idea who sent the obituary. It may be the one secret I never find out. And then jokingly, I'm like, if anyone ever finds out, you just let me know. I'm curious.
Doesn't it drive you nuts?
A little bit.
I would want to know. I want to know now.
I think everybody wants to know. Maybe one day. I do completely understand, right? The person who sent the tip is technically an informant for the federal government. And there are rules. And even though for me, it has nothing to do with, I want to know so I can go confront them. I'm just curious and would just love to know how somebody knew. But I understand that this is a federal informant and there are laws to protect people. And I respect that. So if I never find out, it will be okay.
So to go back to your dad, you had mentioned that he was just so relieved when he told you, especially when you kind of validated him that, he was still your dad. But I'm curious about if he ever mentioned how he personally felt about his actions, about his past.
He didn't ever really speak about how he felt about it, other than he really felt like it was his only way out, that he needed to start a new life. He needed to get away from the life he was in. And I firmly believe that he would have restarted if he'd just been working, in a normal store, not a bank. I don't think he would have robbed a bank to start over. But you're working in a bank, you're in charge of the vaults. Starting over is probably a lot easier with money. And while I don't believe that he would ever say, hey, go steal money so you can do whatever you want. At the time, when you're 19, he turned 20 the day before he committed the crime. So he's essentially still a teenager. And I think we all did dumb things when we were teenagers and into our 20s that at the time, I think he thought it was rational. And, at the end of his life, while I'm sure he regretted having to keep a secret, I don't think he would have changed anything because he always wanted just a stable, simple family life. And that's what he got with my mom and then with me.
Did your father ever kind of reflect on it and say, okay, that was a really bad decision that I made? Or was he just kind of at peace with it?
He really was at peace with what his life was. He never said, oh, if I could go back and not do that, I would. And I never really asked him that. That's such a hard thing to answer. Every decision any of us make leads us to where we are now. And even if there were things I would go back and change, then you think, well, what would that change about the rest of my life? I do believe that he would have probably liked to have told us the secret earlier and not have to carry it alone. But I also understand, he knows my mom, he knows me. We are very anxious people. Those 6 months of me knowing the secret about my dad and not telling anybody, I was a crazy paranoid person, thinking that people must know and who's going to show up and does somebody know and what if I accidentally say something? And that was only 6 months. And my dad carried it for 50 years. So I think at some point for him, because he and I both deal with difficult things in the same, probably unhealthy way, which is put them in a box, put that box on a shelf, and you close the door. Because that's the only way you can live a life for 50 years and not be a stressed, anxious, paranoid person. Because my dad was the most relaxed, cool guy. Really person I knew. Nothing fazed him. Nothing stressed him out. And he was the person I would go to when I was spiraling. And he was the person that could ground me. And not just a blanket, oh, everything's fine, but work the problem with me and figure out some solutions. And I just always knew that things would be fine once I talked to my dad. And now to look back and realize that for his whole life, he was a wanted fugitive, I'm shocked that he was able to live the life he did the way he did, to genuinely enjoy being a suburban dad that drove his daughter to school every day and pick up my friend early because we would have women's chorus in the morning in high school. And he would always say, if we leave a few minutes early, we can go to Dunkin' Donuts. And he would get my friends and I hot chocolate as a special treat since we were up super early. And he just enjoyed that stuff. The narrative around my dad was always that he loved the Thomas Crown Affair and he saw the movie so many times, which is true. He had apparently taken a few girls to see the movie. I did confirm that with one of his friends, that he saw the movie and that inspired him, to commit this heist just because he could. And that he was then living this life of luxury. I think they thought he was in Europe, on a yacht somewhere, and that his life really was the opposite. Just going to work every day and cooking dinner and, driving your daughter to school and chaperoning her field trip to walk the Freedom Trail in Boston in 7th grade. That's what he wanted to do.
I'm wondering if part of his almost okay, I'm going to put it in a box and not think about it was related to him getting an identity so quickly. Do you know how or why?
It was the late 60s, early 70s is sort of the blanket. How could you do that? No joke. He just walked into, I don't know what office you go to in Boston, the Social Security office, the town hall, and said, hey, I just got here. I don't have any stuff. My parents had died. I need a Social Security card. And they said, okay, here you go. And they gave him a Social Security card. From the bit of research I did, so now we all get social security cards when we're born, right? Like you're born, you get a social security card. I think it was into the early 70s or at least by the late 60s. A lot of people didn't get social security cards until they were 18. So it wasn't odd for him not to have one. And it wouldn't be weird for somebody to issue a new one if maybe he had one, but it was, lost. My parents died. I don't know. I sold the house. I packed up one suitcase and there's no digital files anywhere. You can't just say, what's your name, and type it into the computer. You couldn't do it now. Thinking about what he did, it would be absolutely impossible today to do what he did. The crime wouldn't be an option. Getting a new identity wouldn't be an option. But life was just really different in the late 60s, early 70s.
Because social security cards people didn't even always have them. That was kind of a newer thing to begin with. So yeah, that makes sense. I remember my grandmother's and it's metal, not even a piece of paper. That's totally possible. I mean, obviously, like to just walk in and it's unfathomable now. We've come a long way.
Yeah, like now, if I said, I lost my social security card and I need another one, they would say, okay, I need your license or a passport and, like a piece of mail and then they would be typing my name into a database and I'm sure my license would come up and they would say, this is her face. This is the girl in front of me. This is her. She has her license. And if that's how that would work. Because I think it was in Boston in 1970, like January of 1970 was when he got the social security card. A social security card wasn't a big deal.
Because now you'd have to forge all kinds of ID and other records just to acquire that.
Yeah. And I mean, he embezzled money from the bank. That's real. But he never forged anything to get his new identity. His social security card was a legal social security card. It was not forged. He had a license, a real license for all intents and purposes. Like he was Tom Randele. They were real. They were not forged documents, which is crazy.
I guess in retrospect, was there any other sign, like in his behavior over the years, that now you might recognize as being connected to his past?
Not necessarily connections to his past life, but there were moments that now make more sense knowing that he was a fugitive. In high school, because I took French, I had the opportunity to go to France, and it was subsidized by the school and parents could go as chaperones. There were only about 12 kids going. And my mom said, absolutely, I'll be a chaperone. She looked to my dad and she said, let's both be chaperones, trip to Europe, because we never would have been able to afford to go if it wasn't through the school and it was subsidized. And she said, we'll chaperone. We like the kids that are going. Little family trip too. Perfect. And my dad said, I don't really feel like going to France. You ladies go and have fun. I'll stay home with the cat. And I remember at the time thinking, weird choice, but okay. He does work and my dad was the one who worked full time. So I was like, maybe he really just, can't take a week off. But it really wasn't something my mom or I thought about. We just said, okay, weirdo, we're going to go to France. But now I realize he couldn't go because to get a passport, you have to have your birth certificate. And he never had a birth certificate for Tom Randele. He had a social security card and a license. To get a passport, you have to have your birth certificate. So he couldn't leave the country.
Maybe he also who was going to take care of the cat?
See, at the time, that was the logic. And now I think back too, I guess he used to go to Canada once in a while with his friends. Like in the 70s, talking to those guys are like, yeah, you just like drive up to Montreal for the weekend. And I think my parents went a couple times. When you live in New England, going up to Canada is like a thing. I've been a few times. And I remember once saying, the three of us, like, we should do like a weekend. We could drive up to Montreal and that would be fun. And him saying something about, yeah, but it's kind of a long drive. And I don't know, maybe we could drive up to Maine instead. And when I look back, I realized that was after they changed the laws where when I was a kid, at least, and going into high school, you only needed your license to go to Canada if you were a US citizen. You didn't need a passport. Then they changed it at one point. Now to go to Canada, you have to have your passport. And that's when Dad was like, I don't want to go to Canada. Been there. And I realized, there were a few trips my mom wanted to go on. He would always say that he didn't think he needed to leave the country because there were so many beautiful things to see in the US. And at the time I thought, that's like really nice. Like he wants to see the whole country. But yeah, I mean, he couldn't leave because he couldn't get a passport. And so looking back, that's a huge thing that stands out. That at the time, he needed to stay home with the cat and work. Totally valid. I was like, I get it. But now I look back and think, oh, I bet he would have loved to have gone to France with mom and me. And the kids that were taking French were my friends and my dad knew them. Like he would have genuinely enjoyed that, like being the fun chaperone. And he couldn't.
You have Ted Conrad and then you have Tom Randele. So how do you kind of reconcile these two images?
Finding out that my dad, Tom Randele, was a fugitive that committed this crime was super out of character for my dad. But then similarly, in talking to people that knew Ted Conrad, him committing this crime was just completely out of character. So the crime itself, didn't line up with who Ted Conrad was or who Tom Randele was. And then in talking to Ted's friends and hearing stories about him, the way that they talk about him, the kinds of stories they would tell about him being that friend that's always there for them and you could count on him. And he was just super thoughtful and kind and just a really good guy who always made you feel special and that he was happy to see you, is the exact same way that my dad's friends talk about him and always have. I think that I was worried when I started this process of investigating my dad in this podcast that I was going to find out some things that upset me or that were out of character for my dad. And I am incredibly thankful that what I found out is that the guy that I knew, my dad, Tom Randele, the guy my mom knew, that all of his friends knew, it really is the same guy. He's the friend that, you can count on when you need a shoulder to lean on. He's the guy that will lend you his lawnmower when you need, when yours breaks, but then he won't really lend it to you. He'll just come over and mow your lawn because you're probably dealing with enough and he'll just take care of it. I heard almost the same story from two different friends, one from the 70s here in Boston and then one from his friend back in Cleveland, about how both of them had little sisters who had been injured and were in the hospital. And how my dad on the way to work would just stop in for 5 minutes. So that way, if nobody else had a chance to go to the hospital that day, they would have at least had a visitor for a couple minutes. And it was nearly the identical story, decades apart. And I thought, that's my dad. Whatever his name is, he is this really kind, thoughtful guy who genuinely cares about people and wants people to be happy.
He really does sound like he was an amazing person and a great person. But how did this revelation affect your family dynamics and relationship with other relatives?
That was definitely a worry. And I can specifically remember my mom being very worried that when friends or family found out that they would judge my dad harshly and that they would end up judging her. I think a big fear for her was that people would think she was foolish or naive or dumb. Because how could you be married to somebody for nearly 40 years and not know? And I said to her, nobody who knows you would think that. It's not like there were red flags that everybody in our life said, there's got to be something up with him. Nobody suspected that he had this secret. And I've never been so thankful that when all of this came out in November of 21, friends and, our whole extended family said, he's still Tom. We love him. I mean, if anything, this makes him a little bit cooler. So, because it could have gone the other way, right? Like you could have had friends and family that, maybe did judge him, but it hasn't changed the way that anybody who knew him thinks about him. And in a lot of ways, when they find out, why he did it and what his life was like beforehand, you're almost a little impressed the life that he could live and the person that he was, knowing that maybe his upbringing wasn't the easiest or the most loving.
What has this experience taught you about forgiveness, secrets, or just, how complex humans can be?
Jokingly, can't trust anyone, right? Everybody has secrets. But on a serious note, really, everybody does have secrets. And you just hope that the people you care about are able to tell them to you, or you really understand that if people can't share everything, that it's not because they don't trust you. It's, things that they're dealing with. Sometimes I wonder if my dad hadn't been terminally ill when we found this out, if it would have changed, how the conversation went. But for my mom and I, we were just happy to be able to have those conversations and to learn a lot about my dad in a month. Like so many things that my mom never even knew about him. And we got closer in him sharing that secret. It was hard to carry afterwards, but I'm glad that he was able to talk to us about it.
Have you ever discussed or speculated on what might have driven your dad to his actions and how he felt about it later in life?
So growing up, the very limited times my dad would talk about his family, I just always assumed that he grew up the way I did, with two parents that loved each other and a happy house, because he really didn't talk about it a lot. So I just figured, especially for the kind of dad he was, a super engaged dad who was there just as much as mom. You figure you learn that from somebody. So I just always assumed his childhood was like mine. What I found out after he told us about why he committed the crime and changed his name and started over, his home life was pretty rough. His parents had divorced after his mom left his dad for another man. And dad's new stepfather was just a very, very cruel man who really emotionally tormented my dad. And every day told him he was good for nothing, couldn't do anything right, terrible kid. And my dad was in middle school when that happened. And everybody I've spoken to who knew Ted reiterated that home life wasn't great. And even when you move out, right, you're still in the same city, that's still your family. And he told me that he just had to get out, that he wouldn't make it if he'd stayed. So I do firmly believe that he always would have left. He would have hit his breaking point and said, I'm just going to cut everybody off and I'm moving far away. And I'll figure it out when I get there. When you're a 19-year-old kid and all you want to do is get away from the people who are telling you you're worthless and you're working in a room full of money, I get that you think I could just take some of this and it would help me get an apartment and I could start a life somewhere and maybe I can find some happiness. So for him, it was never about the money. It was about what the money could get him. And it enabled him to move to Boston and to get an apartment and to get settled and established. Well, really, by the time he started dating my mom, I think in 1977, 1978, the money was gone. He was working then a regular job, living in a regular apartment. But it allowed him to get to Boston and make a group of friends and establish a life. I always think that, it wasn't so much that he was on the run, that he was running away.
What advice would you give people or anyone who is dealing with a shocking family revelation or secret?
It's hard. And I was lucky because I had my mom and she had me and we could lean on each other. I can't imagine carrying a secret like that alone. I think what was really helpful for me was getting as much information as I could. So I felt like I could get my bearings and then really decide how I felt. And for me, that was talking to my dad and asking him a lot of questions. Also me going online and reading article after article that had been written about my dad for 40 plus years. I'm also thankful that the secret I found out wasn't something that was super horrifying. I went on America's Most Wanted a few months ago because they had actually covered my dad in the 90s. And one of the things we talked about was, when you find out a secret, do you keep it? Do you not? And luckily for me, my dad's crime was a nonviolent crime. It wasn't as though he had stolen the life savings of a family and left them destitute. It wasn't a secret where I thought, we have to tell someone right now. So for me, it was a little bit easier ethically to decide what to do with the secret. But I think the most important thing is taking whatever time you need to really decide how you feel and to not make any snap decisions in the moment. But that everybody has secrets, everybody's complicated, and generally, nobody should be judged solely on their worst day, right? That's one day. And one of the reasons that I launched my podcast was that in November of 21 and after, if you Googled my dad, if you put in Tom Randele, the results page would erase his name and put Theodore J. Conrad. And it was just article after article about, fugitive on the run for 50 years, caught, deathbed confession, stole the money. And it felt like my dad was being erased, that the only thing he would ever be remembered for was one day in July of 1969 when he was 20 years old. And it was in that moment that I said, I don't know how, but I'm going to share who my dad really is. And I'm not trying to erase July 11th of 1969, but I'm trying to put it in context so that my dad is remembered for more than just that one day. Because it did. It felt like I had lost him in May, and then it felt like I was losing him all over again because the world was just reading about a wanted fugitive. And there was so much more to him than that.
You've also just discussed, how the public kind of saw him, or, if you Google him, this is what you'd find. But is there anything, I guess, you would like the public to remember about your dad, or anything specific you want to highlight about him?
The most important thing for me is recognizing how special he was. I always knew he was special to me as my dad. I'm a little bit biased, but I was so shocked in making the podcast and talking to all of his friends, how special he was to everyone else. That the people who knew Ted, the people who knew Tom, that he stands out in all their lives as a truly special guy. And that 3 years later, he's still just as missed as he was the day that we lost him. And I hear that over and over again from everyone who knew him, that he was just so special and almost this bright spot in everyone's life, everybody who knew him.
Has there been any legal or ethical dilemmas that you've kind of had to face when the world kind of knew about your dad?
Thank goodness, nothing legal. The crime was committed before my dad even knew my mom, and the money was gone before they got married. So thankfully, nothing legal, but ethically deciding, do we tell the authorities? That's the big ethical question. And my mom and I did decide, yes, we would. We would wait the year. Somebody beat us to it, but we did always intend to let the marshals know. This is Ted Conrad. He's passed away. Happy to do whatever you need to close it. But we did know that they deserved to have closure professionally. But then also in reading about Pete Elliott and his dad, John Elliott, from a personal level, I mean, my mom and I both knew that it was incredibly important for Pete to have closure. I mean, we didn't even know him at the time. And now knowing him, he's just an amazing guy. And I'm glad that he was able to close the case that his dad had spent his career working on.
Do you guys have like lunch and stuff or what?
No lunch, because he's in Cleveland and I'm in Boston. But he really is somebody that I go to for advice. When my co-host on the podcast, Jonathan, had reached out to me, we ended up having a great conversation. And I remember thinking, I think I've found the person that's going to help me tell my dad's story. And he had mentioned that he had spoken to Pete. So I then called Pete and said, hey, have you talked to this Jonathan Hirsch guy? What do you think of him? I'm thinking of working with him. And Pete said, I think he's a stand-up guy. I think he's a great journalist. I think he wants to tell a real story. For Pete to say, I think this person's like a good guy or a good woman, then I'm like on board with them. So Pete is somebody now that like I go to for advice, and he's great. He checks in on my mom, to make sure that she's doing well. So he is like a family friend now, which I know is bonkers to think that the person who's been chasing your dad for decades, you now consider somebody that you can go to for advice and would count as a friend. I do know that sounds bonkers, but it's true.
In what ways has the revelation about your dad's past influenced your personal growth or perspective on life?
Knowing what my dad did and really finding out why he did it, that he'd had such a rough home life, made me even more thankful for the way I grew up, and made me realize that my dad, who was one of those people who always said, like if you can do the kind thing, do the kind thing, do things the right way. He was always a stickler about that. And you realize that sometimes people that grow up with abuse, that's not the way they go. Abuse can perpetuate abuse. And for my dad to be such a genuinely good and kind person has made me sort of notice that more. And I generally think I'm a nice person, and I do try to do the right thing. And I like people to be happy, and I like to be the person that can make them happy. But I think I'm more conscious of it now, because you never know what somebody else is going through. I never in my whole life would have for a second even thought that my dad's parents weren't wonderful to him. And that's my dad, who I thought I knew so well. So I also now think you don't know what that person next to you on the bus is going through that day. You don't know, what the person taking your ticket at the movie theater, like what happened that afternoon to them. And so I even more so now always try to think what someone else is going through and how can I help?
Well, in terms of you, tell us about your podcast.
So it is called My Fugitive Dad. You can listen to all episodes for free anywhere you listen to podcasts, the big ones being iTunes and Spotify. And it is part caper, part personal investigation. It really does follow two families, the Elliots, John and Pete Elliott, who are searching for the truth, and then another family, my mom and me, who were unwittingly living a lie. The original music that was written for it is stunning. My co-host, Jonathan Hirsch, is just an incredible storyteller. I had never made a podcast. I'd never really listened to podcasts before I made this. And it impresses me so much. I just think that it's beautifully done. And you can either listen to it in an afternoon. The episodes are only 35 to 40 minutes, or on your way to work. Just listen to one every day.
And this is available everywhere?
Everywhere. I only know about iTunes and Spotify because I'm not super technological, but I have friends who are like, I listen to it here and on my computer. It's everywhere and it's free.
Everybody, please go listen to the podcast. It is really amazing to listen to.
My Fugitive Dad.
What a cool name.
True. So when I went to the Mark Summers show, when I was on stage, Mark is, so what do you do? And I never know what to say to that now. I was like, I just finished wrapping up a podcast. And he was like, well, I do podcast. He has a podcast. Mark Summers has a podcast. And he was like, I have one called this. And he's like, what's yours called? And I'm in a theater. And I was like, it's called My Fugitive Dad. And everyone in the audience was like, what? And I was like, if you don't have context, it could sound worse. I was like, it's a fun listen. The last episodes are kind of sad. I'm supposed to warn people. My best friend got very mad at me when I didn't warn her about the last episode. And she sent me a picture of her ugly crying and was like, you need to warn people. So there's my warning.
And hopefully Mark Summers has listened to it. Something tells me he has.
How cool would that be? And then I'd be like, I was talking to her and she was wearing a Double Dare shirt. You should go on their podcast. Even if you don't have anything to do with what they do,
we'll figure it out. We'll find something. If I could talk to Mark Summers, that would complete me.
It's the bucket list item people don't know they need.
We'll get him. We'll find him.
It's easy to be resentful of everything if you go through hardships like that.
See, it's so crazy. The things that I always now draw back to my dad. I'm like, Mark Summers, you and my dad would have gotten along so well because neither one of you had sunshine and rainbows lives, but you're both out in the world making people happy and trying to make the world a little bit better. Did you guys ever see that movie Spirited with Will Ferrell and Ryan Reynolds? So it came out 3 years ago. It's on Apple TV. And it is a retelling of Charles Dickens, the Ghosts of Christmas Past, Present, and Future. So it's a retelling, but it's from the perspective of the ghosts. It's a whole office where they're like, this is our job and this is what we do. There is a song at the end that when I first watched it, I was hysterically crying because the song at the end is called A Little Bit of Good. And the whole premise is just do a little good, do what you can. And some days you do good and other days you slip, but then the next day you just try to be better. And that's all any of us can do is just try to do a little good. And every time I hear it, I just cry. Crazy takeaway from everything is just try to do some good every day and watch that movie. You guys will love it.
Thanks so much, Ashley. This was a lot of fun.
I had a great time. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for being on. We really appreciate it.
We'd like to thank Ashley for sharing her and her father's story with us. You can learn more about Ashley and her relationship with her father, as well as the story of John and Pete Elliott, by checking out her podcast, My Fugitive Dad. You can find it wherever you find your podcasts, and we'll also have a link in the episode's show notes.
Yep, and that's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. Find us on social media. We're on X, we're on Threads, we're on Instagram and TikTok. And obviously you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.
Until next time.